Hi again, I'm Adam Elwanger, professor at University of Houston downtown. We're doing a series of lectures on rhetoric here for my graduate course entitled Rhetorical Theory and Criticism. We just finished a discussion of Roman rhetoric and the context of Cicero's De Oratore. We talked about how it's a framed story that Cicero relates to show what he's learned about rhetoric over the course of his political life. And now we're going to get into the contents of the story that he offers. Note that at the beginning, this is at the bottom of the first column on 292 in the rhetorical tradition. Speaking to his brother, Cicero says, "Look, I'm not going to recall from the cradle of our boyish learning of days gone by a long string of precepts about rhetoric, but I shall repeat the things I heard of as once handled in a discussion between men who were the most eloquent of our nation and of the highest rank and distinction of every kind. Not that I despise what the Greek craftsmen and teachers of oratory have left us, but that it's open to the view and ready to the hand of everyone. Nor could it be more happily set forth or more clearly expounded by any interpretation of my own. So that you will forgive me, brother mine, I do believe, if I prefer to Greek instruction, the authoritative judgment of those to whom the highest honors and eloquence have been awarded by our own fellow countrymen." All right, his point here is one about theoria versus praxis, or theory versus practice. He says that he's not going to rehearse the precepts that they learned in the schools of their boyhood. He's not just going to rehearse general rhetorical theoretical rules. Rather, he's going to rehearse insights that he received at a discussion between men who had actually done something in the political life of Rome through the use of oratory. And so again, we have this distinction between the vita contemplativa and the vita activa, the active life versus the passive life. Cicero is going to relate to us knowledge that he received from doers of the art, not Greek theorists. Okay, and as we'll see, as the story takes shape, there is a fair amount of friendly and sometimes not so friendly competition between the Greeks and the Romans. And in this text, that takes the shape of Cicero's, the men in Cicero's story, taking a lot of shots at the Greeks. And we'll look at some of those passages in a moment. All right. So the story that he gives is of, I think, 5 men on a getaway to a place for the Roman Games, which would be like our Olympics, right? They go to a vacation home. And so they basically, they're all people who have been active in public life, but it's a time for celebration. It's the beginning of the Roman Games, their Olympics, and so they decide to take some time off, some leisure time, to go and enjoy the games. And when they come back to this vacation house that they have, I was going to say that they rented, but they were probably rich enough that one of them owned it. Might actually say that in the text. Anyways, I was curious. But when they get back to the house, right, there's no TV or anything like there would be now. They say, well, what should we do? You know, and some of the younger men that are with them say, hey, what if you guys told us all the stuff that you learned over the course of your political careers about rhetoric and how to succeed in oratory? And eventually they make a joke about Plato's Phaedrus. They say, well, look, we're in this beautiful setting on this getaway. Why don't we just do it like Plato or Socrates and Phaedrus did it in Plato's dialogue, and we'll be in this beautiful setting, and y'all can talk to us about your wonderful achievements in rhetoric. Now, it's interesting, this scenario, because, right, it seems very much in setting this up explicitly like a Greek dialogic affair or dialectical affair, right? It seems that we're getting dangerously closely to detached, abstract, theoretical just BSing, right? But it's important to remember that they're playing a game here and that they're on vacation, right? They wouldn't be doing this if they weren't on vacation. They're on vacation because, in fact, their lives are so active, right? And so it's kind of a game playing that, hey, what if while we're on this time off, we just act like the Greeks and sit around and have this dialogue where we think about what oratory means and how to achieve its excellence. All right, so let's look at the characters in the dialogue really quickly. Lucius Crassus is perhaps the main character. He was a prominent orator of his day. Cicero probably studied under him. And a lot of readers of this text see Crassus as the mouthpiece for Cicero, right? That what Crassus says is parallels Cicero's thoughts about rhetoric. So Lucius Crassus is probably the most respected and eminent person in this conversation. Then there's Quintus Mucius, which is, he also gets called Scaevola in the dialogue, and that is Crassus's father-in-law, another patrician. Then there's Marcus Antonius, who is a professional colleague of Crassus, and a friend, obviously. And then there are two younger men, Gaius Cotta and Publius Sulpicius. And both of these men are men who are kind of at the outset of their professional careers and who have already been earmarked by the older, more accomplished men as that these are kind of up-and-coming people in the life of Rome. And they've kind of brought them along. And it's these two younger men who say, well, tell us everything that you guys know because we want to become great people in the public life of Rome, and you know what we need, so let's hear it. And so that's the beginning of the dialogue. Those are the characters. Okay. So, Crassus begins on page 293 by saying that oratory is the one art that has always flourished above the rest and ever reigned supreme. And he says, for what is so marvelous as that? Out of the innumerable company of mankind, a single being should arise who either alone or with a few others can make effective a faculty bestowed by nature upon every man. Or what so pleasing to the understanding and the ear as a speech adorned and polished with wise reflections and dignified language? Or what achievement so mighty and glorious as that the impulses of the crowd, the consciousness of the judges, the austerity of the Senate should suffer transformation through the eloquence of one man? What function, again, is so kingly, so worthy of the free, so generous as to bring help to the suppliant, to raise up those that are cast down, to bestow security, to set free from peril, to maintain men in their civil rights? What, too, is so indispensable as to have always in your grasp weapons wherewith you can defend yourself, or challenge the wicked man, or when provoked, to take your revenge? So basically he says, hey, what is there that rhetoric can't do? This is amazing. And notice that he seems to talk about persuasion as transformation, that it can transform the hearer. And then they go into a brief dialogue about how rhetoric was the condition of civilization itself, right? He says, this is where men themselves are superior to animals. To come, however, at length to the highest achievements of eloquence, what other power could have been strong enough to either gather sacred humanity into one place or lead it out of its brutish existence in the wilderness up to our present condition of civilization as men and as citizens? or after the establishment of social communities to give shape to laws, tribunals, and civic rights. In other words, he says, very emergence of the city or the state or civilization as a whole is due to the human capacity to use rhetoric, to communicate ideas through the use of oratory. And then Crassus states his thesis, right? And if you can call it such. He says, not to pursue any further instances of rhetoric's excellence, although there's tons of them, I will conclude the whole matter in a few words. For my assertion is this, that the wise control of the complete orator is that which chiefly upholds not only his own dignity, but the safety of countless individuals and of the entire state, right? And so again, we return to the vita activa in the political life, and he suggests that the political life of Rome hinges entirely on rhetoric. This is different, right? There were latent political concerns for rhetoric in Aristotle and in Plato. And in Plato, the political functions of rhetoric get pretty explicit criticism, right? But here we have a positive imagining of rhetoric as the guarantor of political life as such. And so this is a very interesting and very non-Greek in some ways understanding of rhetoric. Okay. Let's look at some of these parts that insult the Greeks so that we can deepen this contrast between Platonic Greek conceptions of rhetoric and Roman definitions of rhetoric. And so, Crassus says, and this is on 295 in the second column, a little more than halfway down, Crassus says, I know very well, Scaevola, that these views of yours are often put forward and discussed among the Greeks. For I listened to their most eminent men on my arrival in Athens as a quaestor from Macedonia, at a time when the academy was at its best, as was then asserted, with Charmadas, Clytomachus, and Aeschines to uphold it. There was also Metrodorus, who, together with the others, had been a really diligent disciple of the illustrious Carneades himself, a speaker who, for spirited and copious oratory, surpassed, it was said, all other men. Mnesarchus, too, was in his prime, a pupil of your great Panatius, and Diodorus, who studied under Critolaus, the Peripatetic. There were many others of distinguished fame as philosophers, by all of whom, with one voice as it were, I perceived that the orator was driven from the helm of the state, shut out from all learning and knowledge of more important things, and thrust down and locked up exclusively in law courts and petty little assemblies, as if in a pounding mill. But I was neither in agreement with these men, nor with the author and originator of such discussions, who spoke with far more weight and eloquence than all of them, and I mean Plato, whose Gorgias I read with close attention under Charmadas during those days at Athens. And what impressed me most deeply about Plato in that book was that it was when making fun of orators that he himself seemed to me to be the consummate orator. In fact, controversy about a word has long tormented those Greeklings, fonder as they are of argument than truth. Okay, so a few things. One, he looks at all the Greeks that he's learned from and says, look, almost all of them agree that we need to keep the rhetors and orators out of the political realm, mainly because they were associated with sophistic manipulations of public opinion, right? But here we see that Crassus says, no, on the contrary, right? The center of the state is where the ideal orator belongs. And further, he suggests right, that in Plato's Gorgias, while Plato is showing through Socrates why rhetoric is such a bad thing, it is Socrates himself who seems to be the most adept at using rhetoric. And finally, right, he disses the Greeks by saying that they care more about argumentation than truth. And again, that's this vision of, 5 or 6 people in the Platonic dialogue whiling the afternoon away talking about what a word means, right? And he says that these people are just arguing in a controversy over a word. What's the word? Rhetoric, right? And again, that's where Plato's Gorgias starts out. Socrates says, Gorgias, well, what do you call yourself? And Gorgias says, well, I'm a rhetorician, and that means I'm great in rhetoric. And they're like, well, what's rhetoric, right? And then they go on for the next 50 pages about all this other stuff, this extrinsic to the question, like, well, is it better to do wrong or to suffer wrong? And, right, this would be this kind of thing that irks the Romans, right? You set out to define rhetoric, and you end up in some hypothetical ethical scenario about punishment and this and that, which of course all do relate back to rhetoric, but in very precarious roundabout ways. So we can find elsewhere where they mock the Greeks. Alright, this is on page 302. Sorry if the shine of my head is killing you guys when I bend down. But that's life. It's life. Alright, so page 303, second column, about maybe 2 inches down. Well then, said Sulpicius, what we ask you to tell us first is your opinion of the view Antonius advanced just now, whether you hold that there is any such thing as an art of oratory. In other words, they're debating, is rhetoric a techne? Right? How now, exclaimed Crassus, do you think I'm some idle, talkative Greekling, who's also perhaps full of learning and erudition, that you propound me a petty question on which to talk as I will? For when was it, think you, that I troubled myself about these matters, or reflected upon them, and did not rather always laugh to scorn the effrontery of those persons who, from their chairs in the schools, would call upon any man in the crowded assemblage to propound any question that he might have to put? It is related that Gorgias of Leontini was the author of this practice, who was thought to be undertaking and professing something very magnificent, when he advertised himself as ready for any topic whatever on which anyone might have a fancy to hear him. Later, however, they began to do this everywhere, and are doing it to this day, with the result of there being no theme so vast, so unforeseen, or so novel, that they do not claim to be prepared to say about it all that there is to be said. But I had supposed that you, Cotta, or you, Sulpicius, wished to listen to anything of the kind. I would have brought some Greek with me, or somebody else here to amuse you with discussions of this sort, and even now this can be easily managed. For staying with Marcus Piso, a young man, but already given up to this pursuit, possessing talent of the highest order and deeply devoted to myself, there's Statius the Peripatetic, a man whom I know well enough, and who, as I understand to be agreed among experts, is quite supreme in that department of his. Statius? What Statius? What Peripatetic are you talking to me about? Said Mucius. It is for you, Crassus, to comply with the wishes of these young men who don't want the everyday chatter of some unpracticed Greek or old sing-songs out of the schools, but something from the wisest and most eloquent man in the world, and one who, not in the pages of pamphlets, but in the most momentous causes, and that too in this seat of imperial power and splendor, holds the first place for judgment and eloquence. They're anxious to learn the opinion of the man whose footsteps they long to follow. Okay. Full frontal assault on the Greeks, right? And what they talk about is this Greek knack for talking around questions, doing it in little books instead of in the assembly, and these things. And all of the men participating seem to agree, no, that is not the place of rhetoric. The place of rhetoric is not in the schoolroom or in the corner of, somebody's lecture hall or in the pages of a book. It is in the center of the political life of the polis. Just so happens that tonight is President Trump's second State of the Union, right? People will probably be complaining tomorrow, oh, it was so rhetorical, there was so much rhetoric, and it's like, well, no, that's what it's supposed to be. This is rhetoric in context, in the moment, unfolding before us, inviting our responses to it, right? That's how the political realm works. Okay. On 304, we get to an important point because Crassus finally turns his hand on this question of whether it's a techne or a hexis that is rhetoric. So, let me read. This is 304, first column, halfway down. For my part, answered the other, I'm anxious to humor your friends, and I'll make no difficulty about saying, in my brief fashion, what I think upon each point. And to that first question, since I don't think it dutiful, Scaevola, for me to disregard your claims, here it is, I answer that I think there is either no art of speaking at all, or a very thin one, all the quarreling in learned circles being really based on a dispute about a word. What is rhetoric? For, as Antonius just now explained, an art is defined as consisting in things thoroughly examined and clearly apprehended, and which are also outside the control of mere opinion or doxa, and within the grasp of exact knowledge. Then to me there seems to be no such thing as an art of oratory. For all the kinds of language we ourselves use in public speaking are changeable matter and adapted to the general understanding of the crowd. And we're going to come back to that, but let's keep going. If, however, the actual things noticed in the practice and conduct of speaking have been heeded and recorded by men of skill and experience, if they've been defined in terms, illuminated by classification, and distributed under subdivisions, and I see that it has been possible to do this, then I don't understand why this shouldn't be regarded as an art. Perhaps not in the precise sense of the term, but at any rate according to the other and popular estimate. But whether this be an art or something like an art, assuredly it is not to be disdained. Okay. Alright, few things there. He says, look, there's either no art or there's a thin art. But that first statement is, he backs off of it by saying, well, it's not really an art because there's not a precise knowledge to it. In other words, there's not principles that are going to hold to every situation and context. Partly because the world of practice is much more complicated than the world of theory. But then he says, but look, if we could generalize terms, if we could use a common vocabulary to describe this, if we could come up with some general precepts that are generally applicable to practice, even if not always applicable, then why not? Why can't it be an art? He says it's maybe not like other arts, but it's still like we should call it an art for that reason. And he says he's seen it done before. And presumably he's talking about Aristotle's rhetoric here, where Aristotle painstakingly subdivides and classifies different types of rhetorical techniques and concepts. And so it seems that they settle on that it probably is some kind of art, and even if it's not, it's still not a bad thing, as the Platonic line of criticism would suggest. Let's back up to that moment when he says that we ourselves use in public speaking our changeable manner and adapted to the general understanding of the crowd. Bear in mind that this is precisely the thing that was the problem with rhetoric for Plato, is that the higher truths, the episteme, had to get watered down so that it is accessible to the general public or the demos. And in that process, that these truths got infected with pistis or belief or doxa or public opinion. But here, the men in the dialogue seem to concede, well, yes, of course, like we changed the content to suit the general public understanding of these questions. And they phrase that as a good thing. And I think it's especially powerful when Cicero himself, and this is before the framed story begins, he says, let's look at the passage on 290, right? He says, whereas in all other arts that is most excellent, which is farthest removed from the understanding and mental capacity of the untrained, in oratory, the very cardinal sin is to depart from the language of everyday life and the language approved by the sense of the community. This is actually a shocking claim that Cicero is making here, that the very number one highest sin in oratory and rhetoric is to use a way of speaking that departs from the way that everyday people talk, right? And we can see in our own political life how true this can be when we hear someone talking in a style or in a tone that seems to exclude us as the audience because it's so high in style, right? Cicero seems to favor a mode of delivery that's accessible to the common person. And so in this sense, he understands that the effectiveness of rhetoric is ultimately bound to the collective or the public acceptance of it. And if the public decides that they are not having it, then it's not going to happen. And so in some sense, the public are the gatekeepers to persuasion. Let's see. There are so many other things that we could talk about as results, as relates to Plato. He talks about logos, pathos, ethos. I might look at one passage on ethos because we'll be focusing so much on ethos later in the semester. Let's look at one passage on ethos. This is on page 296, second column. Bottom of the second column, about 4 lines up. It says, who indeed does not know that the orator's virtue is preeminently manifested either in rousing men's heart to anger or hatred or indignation, or recalling them from these emotions to mildness and mercy. Wherefore the speaker will not be able to achieve what he wants by his words, unless he has gained profound insight into the characters of men, and the whole range of human nature, and those motives whereby our souls are spurred on or turned back. And all of this is considered to be the special province of philosophers. Nor will the orator, if he take my advice, resist their claim. But when he has granted their knowledge of these things, since they have devoted all their labor to that alone, still he will assert his own claim to the oratorical treatment of them, which without that knowledge of theirs is nothing at all. For this is the essential concern of the orator, as I have often said before, a style that is dignified and graceful and in conformity with the general modes of thought and judgment. So again, he reiterates the importance of rhetoric's accessibility to the general public, but he also notes the link between virtue in the eyes of an audience and pathos, the manipulation of audience emotions, and further, the knowledge of the character types that determine which emotions can be evoked. So there's this tight link here between ethos and pathos, both in the orator and in the audience. Again, so much to talk about in De Oratory. I've picked a few themes, that of how they relate to Greek rhetoric, to offer a contrast between Roman rhetoric and Greek rhetoric. This question of whether or not rhetoric is a techne or a hexis. That is, whether it can be learned or whether it's a habit or a knack or something. And also, we discuss the importance of adopting a rhetorical style that is near to the audience's common ways of speech and thinking. So thanks very much. We'll be back in a few weeks, with maybe even sooner, with some more. I hope you have a great day. Thank you.